For centuries, absolute wealth and terrifying power allowed the Lancaster family to rule the shadows of the Pacific Northwest. Yet Victor Lancaster's sole heir, Gabriel, bore a curse no immortal magic could cure. He was born completely deaf in a world where sound is a predator's greatest weapon. He lived in absolute silence until a rainy Tuesday night at a rundown diner. That's when Penelope, a heavily overweight waitress with a stained apron, pulled a tarnished metal object from her pocket, shattering a vampire's silent world forever. Penelope Higgins was not the kind of woman who blended into the background, even if she wanted to. At 26 years old and weighing 280 pounds, she took up space in a world that constantly demanded women shrink themselves. She had soft, wide hips, thick arms, and a round face framed by frizzy auburn hair that fought a losing battle against the humidity of Astoria, Oregon. Penelope had long ago stopped apologizing for her body. She navigated the narrow aisles of the rusty Anchor Diner with a surprising practiced grace, balancing heavy ceramic plates of meatloaf and lukewarm cherry pie on her thick forearms. The diner was a relic of the 1980s, smelling perpetually of stale coffee, industrial bleach, and deep-fried hash browns. Rain lashed against the large plate glass windows, blurring the neon sign outside that buzzed with a faulty R. It was past 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, the graveyard shift, which meant the diner was occupied only by the lonely, the insomniac, and the dangerous. Penelope stood behind the Formica counter, wiping down the surface for the 4th time. Her uniform, a light pink dress that strained slightly at the buttons across her chest, was stained with a splash of gravy near the hem. She sighed, resting her weight on her right leg. Her feet ached. They always did at this hour. The bell above the diner door jingled, though the sound was instantly drowned out by the roar of the coastal storm pouring into the room. Penelope looked up, her practiced customer service smile faltering just a fraction. 2 men stepped into the diner. The shift in the room's atmosphere was instantaneous and suffocating. The older man, Victor Lancaster, possessed an elegance that was violently out of place in the rusty Anchor. He wore a charcoal bespoke suit that repelled the rain. His silver hair perfectly styled his features sharp and aristocratic. He looked like a European billionaire who had taken a wrong turn on the way to a private jet. But it was the younger man who made Penelope's breath hitch. Gabriel Lancaster was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with a terrifyingly fluid stillness. He wore a heavy black peacoat, his dark hair slicked back by the rain, a few stray strands falling across his forehead. His face was a study in pale, cruel perfection, high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes the color of shattered ice. Yet there was a profound, chilling emptiness in his gaze. He didn't look around the room. He didn't react to the sudden crash of thunder outside or the clatter of a fork dropped by a trucker in the corner booth. Gabriel was completely irreversibly deaf. Born into a pure-blood vampire lineage, Gabriel's affliction was a source of great shame to his father. For a creature designed to hear the flutter of a moth's wings from a mile away, deafness was a fatal flaw. He could not hear the terrified heartbeats of his prey, nor the warnings of approaching enemies. He survived by mastering the vibrations of the earth, feeling the world through the soles of his shoes and the shift of air currents against his skin. Victor led Gabriel to the corner booth, the leather squeaking under their weight. Penelope grabbed 2 plastic menus, took a deep breath, and walked over. She was acutely aware of her thighs rubbing together, of the heavy thud of her sensible, non-slip shoes against the checkered linoleum. "Evening," Penelope said, her voice warm, though a bit raspy from fatigue. "Coffee to start." Victor looked up. His eyes, dark and ancient, swept over Penelope. He didn't sneer, but the sheer lack of interest in his expression was worse than an insult. "Just water. Bottled if you have it. Tap if you do not. Neither of us will be eating." Penelope nodded, turning her attention to Gabriel. "And for you, Hon?" Gabriel didn't look at her. He was staring out the window at the rain. "He doesn't hear you," Victor said smoothly, his tone clipped. "And he wouldn't care to answer if he did." Penelope felt a flush of heat rise in her plump cheeks. She had dealt with rude customers before, but there was an icy superiority to Victor that made her skin crawl. She looked back at Gabriel. Up close, she noticed the subtle tension in his jaw, the way his eyes tracked the reflection of the room in the window. He wasn't ignoring her out of spite. He He was entirely sealed off in his own silent universe. "I'll get that water," Penelope said, turning on her heel. As she walked away, Gabriel turned his head. He hadn't heard her voice, but he had felt her approach. The heavy, rhythmic thud of her footsteps was distinct. Unlike the light, scurrying vibrations of the other humans in the diner, Penelope's steps were grounded, solid, and rhythmic. For a vampire who navigated the world entirely through tactile feedback, Penelope was the loudest thing in the room. He watched her retreat, his ice-blue eyes tracking the sway of her wide hips and the sturdy line of her back. There was something strangely grounding about her presence. Penelope returned with 2 glasses of ice water and a bottle of mineral water. She set them down carefully. "Anything else I can get you?" Victor waved a hand dismissively. Gabriel, however, was looking directly at her hands. Penelope was a nervous fidgeter. Deep in the right pocket of her apron, her fingers were wrapped around a heavy, jagged piece of metal. It was a habit she had developed over the years to manage her anxiety. The object was a strange, tuning fork-like pendant made of black, oxidized silver, adorned with what looked like a stylized bat wing. She had found it 3 years ago while cleaning out an abandoned storage unit she'd bought at auction in Portland. It was heavy, cool to the touch, and whenever she held it, it emitted a faint, almost imperceptible hum that calmed her racing heart. Gabriel's eyes stayed fixed on her pocket. He tilted his head. He couldn't see the object, but he felt an odd static in the air, a strange tingling at the base of his skull whenever she stood near. The diner settled back into its dreary rhythm. The Lancasters sat in silence. Victor was reviewing a thick stack of legal documents he had pulled from his briefcase, while Gabriel remained statuesque, a predator resting in a cage of silence. At 3:15 a.m., the door chimed again. Penelope groaned inwardly as a group of 3 local men stumbled in. They reeked of cheap beer and stale cigarette smoke. The loudest of them was Billy Dawson, a mechanic who had caused trouble at the Rusty Anchor more than once. He was heavily intoxicated, his movements jerky and aggressive. Penelope pasted on her professional smile and waddled over to their booth. "What can I get you, boys?" "I'll tell you what I want," Billy slurred, looking Penelope up and down with a cruel, mocking grin. "I want a double cheeseburger, and maybe you should skip your next few meals, Penny. Looking a little softer than usual. Gonna break the chair if you try to sit down." His friends snickered. Penelope felt the familiar heavy sting of the insult. She had heard it 1,000 times, but the humiliation never truly faded. She tightened her jaw, her fingers instinctively diving into her apron pocket to grip the heavy black metal object. "Double cheeseburger for Billy. What else?" Penelope asked, her voice flat, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Billy wasn't satisfied. He reached out his greasy hand, slapping hard against Penelope's thick thigh. "Come on, Penny, give us a smile. Don't be a fat bitch." The sound of the slap echoed in the quiet diner. In the corner booth, Gabriel's head snapped up. He hadn't heard the insult. He hadn't heard the slap, but he felt the sharp, erratic vibration of Billy's aggressive movement through the floorboards, and he felt the sudden tense stillness of Penelope's heavy stance. Gabriel's heightened predatory instincts flared. The static in the air, the strange tingling that emanated from Penelope, suddenly spiked, turning into a jarring, rhythmic pulse that vibrated against Gabriel's fangs. Before Victor could place a hand on his son's arm, Gabriel was out of the booth. He moved with supernatural speed, crossing the diner in a fraction of a second. He didn't run, he simply appeared behind Billy. Penelope gasped, stepping back as the towering pale man loomed over the drunken mechanic. Billy turned, his bleary eyes widening at the sight of Gabriel. "The hell do you want, pal?" Gabriel didn't speak. He reached out with one pale gloved hand and clamped it onto Billy's shoulder. The grip was industrial, crushing bone against bone. Billy screamed, dropping to his knees instantly, the cheap wood of the booth cracking under the sudden shift in weight. "Hey, let him go!" one of Billy's friends yelled, standing up. Gabriel merely turned his head, fixing the man with a look of such absolute predatory malice that the man froze, the color draining from his face. Gabriel applied a fraction more pressure to Billy's shoulder. Billy sobbed, thrashing weakly. "Stop!" Penelope shouted, panic rising in her chest. She stepped forward, her heavy frame moving quickly. "Stop! You're going to break his arm. Get out of here, Billy. All of you out." Gabriel didn't react to her voice. He couldn't. He continued to crush Billy's shoulder, staring down at the man like a scientist observing an insect. Realizing he couldn't hear her, Penelope acted on instinct. She reached out and grabbed Gabriel's forearm. The moment her skin touched his coat, a shockwave of energy ripped through the diner. The black metal object in Penelope's pocket, reacting to the proximity of pure-blood vampire biology, suddenly grew intensely hot. Penelope gasped, letting go of Gabriel and instinctively yanking the object out of her pocket. It was a jagged, tuning fork-shaped piece of dark metal, roughly the size of a smartphone. As she pulled it into the open air, the object began to vibrate violently in her plump palm. It emitted a low, bone-rattling hum. Gabriel froze. He dropped Billy, who instantly scrambled backward and bolted for the door, with his friends leaving a trail of knocked-over chairs. But Gabriel didn't notice them leaving. His icy eyes were locked onto the black metal in Penelope's hand. For the first time in 120 years, Gabriel Lancaster's hands began to shake. Silence had been Gabriel's only companion since birth. His world was a silent film, a series of muted vibrations, flashes of light, and the metallic taste of blood. His auditory nerves were completely dead, withered from a genetic curse passed down through the Lancaster bloodline. But as Penelope held the vibrating dark metal, something impossible happened. The low, bone-rattling hum didn't just vibrate in Gabriel's chest. It bypassed his dead eardrums, entirely traveling directly into his auditory cortex. It was a sound, a real piercing, beautiful, terrifying sound. It sounded like the low tolling of a massive iron bell at the bottom of the ocean. Gabriel stumbled back, his hands flying to his ears, a look of absolute shock twisting his usually stoic features. He let out a ragged, uneven breath, a sound he couldn't control. Victor, who had been watching the altercation with mild annoyance, suddenly stood up, his ancient eyes locked onto the object in Penelope's hand, his face drained of its usual arrogance, replaced by raw, unadulterated shock. "Where did you get that?" Victor whispered. His voice was barely audible, but the absolute command in it made Penelope freeze. Penelope clutched the metal tighter, intimidated by the sudden intensity of both men. I found it in a storage unit. Why, what is it?" Gabriel was staring at Penelope, his chest heaving. The ringing in his head was adjusting, shifting frequencies. The black metal tuning fork wasn't just a noisemaker. It was an ancient relic, a resonator crafted by the first vampire covens centuries ago to communicate across vast distances, relying on the psychic frequencies of the undead. But it was supposed to be a myth lost during the Salem purges. Penelope, terrified by Gabriel's erratic breathing, took a step toward him. "Are you okay? Do you need a doctor?" As she spoke, the words left her lips, and the sound waves hit the vibrating metal in her hand. The metal captured her voice, amplified it, and transmitted it along the vampiric frequency directly into Gabriel's mind. "Are you okay? Do you need a doctor?" Gabriel gasped, his knees buckling slightly. He fell against the counter, sending a napkin dispenser clattering to the floor. He stared up at Penelope, his icy blue eyes wide, completely unmoored. He had heard her. He didn't just feel the vibration of her vocal cords. He heard the rasp in her voice, the genuine concern, the exhaustion, the sweet melodic cadence of her tone. It was the very first human voice he had ever heard in his immortal life, and it belonged to the chubby, grease-stained waitress of the Rusty Anchor. "You," Gabriel choked out his own voice, sounding foreign and harsh to his unused vocal cords. He stared at her, mesmerized. "I hear you." Penelope blinked, utterly confused. "What, you hear me? I thought your dad said you were deaf." "He is," Victor said, stepping forward, his eyes burning with an intense, calculating fire. He looked at Penelope, not with the dismissive disgust from earlier, but with a predatory awe. He looked at her thick waist, her soft face, and then at the ancient, priceless relic glowing faintly in her chubby hand. "He has been deaf since the night he was born, until tonight, until you." Penelope took a step back, her heart hammering against her ribs. The diner suddenly felt much too small. "Look, I don't want any trouble. I just work here. You guys can leave. I won't charge you for the water." Gabriel slowly pushed himself off the counter. The terrifying stillness had left him, replaced by a desperate magnetic pull toward Penelope. He didn't care about the diner, the rain, or his father's machinations. He only cared about the woman holding the key to his senses. He reached out his long, pale fingers, gently wrapping around Penelope's thick, warm wrist. His touch was freezing but surprisingly gentle. "Keep talking," Gabriel pleaded, his icy eyes searching her face with a desperate hunger that made Penelope's breath catch in her throat. "Please, say something else." Penelope stared at the impossibly handsome, terrifying man holding her wrist. She looked at the ancient vampire king watching her from the shadows. The world she knew of double cheeseburgers, cruel mechanics, and aching feet was cracking wide open, and she was standing right on the fault line. "My shift ends at 4, Penelope whispered, the metal relaying her voice perfectly into his mind, ringing like the sweetest music he had ever known. Gabriel smiled, a genuine, heartbreaking smile that transformed his cruel face into something breathtaking. "Then I will wait." At exactly 4 o'clock in the morning, the harsh fluorescent lights of the rusty Anchor diner flickered off, leaving only the dim, amber glow of the security bulbs and the relentless drumming of the coastal Oregon rain against the glass. Penelope Higgins exhaled a long, ragged breath, the sound whistling softly through her teeth. She leaned her heavy frame against the stainless steel counter of the prep area, her thick fingers clumsily untying the greasy strings of her pink apron. Her lower back throbbed with a dull, familiar ache that radiated down her thick thighs and settled into the arches of her swollen feet. It was the physical toll of carrying 280 pounds on hard linoleum for 8 unbroken hours, a burden she bore with silent, stoic endurance. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the cold, jagged edges of the black metal tuning fork. The resonator, that was what the terrifying, impossibly beautiful man in the diner had called it. She pulled it out, resting it on the flat of her palm. It was completely silent, now dormant, looking like nothing more than a piece of rusted junk she had salvaged from a forgotten unit at the Portland Public Storage on 82nd Avenue 3 years ago. She had bought that locker for $40, hoping to find vintage clothes or old records to flip on eBay. Instead, she had found a wooden crate filled with old ledgers, decaying maps of Clatsop County, and this strange, heavy piece of iron. "Penelope." The voice was rough, unpracticed, carrying a strange, resonant cadence that sent a sudden, involuntary shiver down her spine. She spun around, her sensible, non-slip shoes squeaking loudly against the freshly mopped floor. Gabriel Lancaster stood in the narrow hallway leading to the employee break room. He had shed his heavy black peacoat, revealing a fitted, dark cashmere sweater that clung to his broad, sculpted chest and muscular arms. He looked completely out of place, standing next to the stacked boxes of industrial fryer oil and bulk ketchup packets. His pale skin seemed to catch the meager light, and his ice-blue eyes were fixed intensely upon her. He wasn't looking at her the way men usually did, with either immediate dismissal or cruel amusement at her size. He was looking at her as if she were the only source of oxygen in a vacuum. "You're still here?" Penelope whispered, her voice trembling slightly. The moment she spoke, the black metal in her hand flared to life. It didn't burn her, but it grew instantly warm, emitting that same low, bone-rattling hum. Gabriel closed his eyes, his chest rising as he drew in a sharp, shuddering breath. He tilted his head back, savoring the sound, as if it were a physical sensation washing over his skin. "I told you I would wait," Gabriel replied, opening his eyes. His voice was gaining confidence, the syllables becoming less fragmented. "My father has returned to our estate. I stayed. I needed to know. I needed to ensure that what happened was real, that I am not descending into madness." Penelope clutched the resonator tighter. "I don't understand any of this. Your father said you've been deaf since birth. How can you hear me through a piece of scrap metal?" Gabriel took a slow, measured step forward. His movements were completely silent, predatory, yet strangely cautious, as if he were approaching a startled deer. "It is not scrap metal, Penelope. It is a relic of my kind, forged by the original European bloodlines centuries ago. It operates on a psychic frequency specific to vampire biology, designed to transmit tactical commands during the ancient Coven Wars. It bypasses the physical ear entirely, directly stimulating the auditory cortex." He stopped a few feet away from her, his towering height forcing Penelope to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. "My auditory nerves are dead. They always have been. The silence in my mind was absolute. But when you held that object, when your skin made contact with its surface, your bioelectric field activated it, and your voice bridged the chasm." Penelope swallowed hard, her mind racing to process the absolute absurdity of his words. "Vampire biology, bloodlines? Look, mister, I'm just a waitress. I live in a cramped apartment above a laundromat on US Route 101. I eat too many carbohydrates. I struggle to pay my gas bill, and I don't believe in monsters." Gabriel smiled, a soft, melancholy expression that softened the cruel, aristocratic angles of his face. "You do not have to believe in the dark for the dark to exist, Penelope. But I am not here to frighten you. I am here to beg you." "Beg me," Penelope echoed, her heavy brows knitting together in confusion. "To let me listen," Gabriel said, his voice dropping to a raw, vulnerable whisper. He slowly reached out his pale hand, keeping his palm open, asking for permission. "I have existed in a void of silence for 120 years. I have never heard the rain. I have never heard music. I have never heard a human laugh. Tonight, the very first sound that ever pierced my darkness was your voice. It is the most beautiful thing I have ever experienced." A hot flush of embarrassment and profound shock spread across Penelope's round, flushed cheeks. She was intensely hyper-aware of her appearance. Her frizzy, humidity-ruined auburn hair, the sweat staining the underarms of her tight pink uniform, the distinct heavy roll of her stomach pressing against the fabric. Beautiful was a word that had never, not once, in her entire 26 years of life been directed at her. She was the funny friend, the reliable worker, the target of cruel jokes from mechanics like Billy Dawson. She was never the beautiful one. "You're mocking me?" Penelope said, her voice defensively hardening. She took a step back, her heavy hips bumping against the prep counter. "I don't know what kind of sick game you and your rich father are playing, but you need to leave. I'm calling a cab and going home." Gabriel's expression immediately shifted from reverence to panic. He dropped his hand, realizing he had crossed a boundary. "No, please. I swear to you on my existence I am not mocking you. I cannot read your thoughts, Penelope, but I can feel your pulse. I can feel the change in your body temperature. You are afraid and you are entirely guarded. I understand why, but you must believe me. When I look at you, I do not see what the humans in this miserable diner see. I see the woman who shattered my silence." He gestured toward the door. "Let me drive you home. The storm is worsening. My vehicle is outside. You will be safe with me. I give you my word as a Lancaster." Penelope looked at him, searching his ice-blue eyes for any trace of deception, any hint of the cruel amusement she was so used to seeing in men's faces. She found nothing but raw, desperate sincerity. She looked down at the black metal tuning fork in her hand. It was still humming softly, a comforting vibration against her calloused skin. It felt like a tether connecting her to this impossible creature. Against her better judgment, against every survival instinct screaming at her to run from the man who had just crushed a mechanic's shoulder with his bare hands, Penelope gave a slow, hesitant nod. "Fine, but I'm holding on to this. And if you try anything weird, I don't know what I'll do, but I'll figure something out." "I expect nothing less," Gabriel said, stepping back to give her space to pass. They walked out the back exit of the Rusty Anchor into the torrential downpour. The cold, salty wind off the Columbia River whipped Penelope's frizzy hair across her face. Parked in the alleyway was a sleek midnight black Maybach, its paint gleaming like spilled ink under the streetlights. Gabriel opened the passenger door for her. Penelope climbed in, wincing slightly as she maneuvered her wide hips into the luxurious leather seat. The interior smelled of expensive cologne and old leather, a sharp contrast to the grease and bleach of the diner. Gabriel slid into the driver's seat. The engine started with a silent, powerful purr. He didn't turn on the radio. He just sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on Penelope. "Talk to me," Gabriel requested softly. "Tell me anything. Tell me about the rain. Tell me about your life. Just let me hear the cadence of your words." As the Maybach pulled out onto the slick, wet asphalt of US Route 101, Penelope Higgins, the chubby waitress who had spent her entire life trying to remain unseen, began to speak, and for the first time someone truly desperately listened. The drive through Astoria was hauntingly beautiful in the dead of night. The heavy rain washed the sleepy coastal town in shades of grey and silver. Penelope found herself talking about things she hadn't spoken of in years. She talked about her childhood in Portland, her struggles with her weight, the endless cycle of diets and disappointments, and the bizarre comfort she found in the rhythmic, predictable chaos of the diner. She spoke into the quiet interior of the Maybach, her voice amplified by the dark metal resting on her lap, transmitting directly into Gabriel's mind. Gabriel drove with terrifying precision, his eyes navigating the dark, winding coastal roads with supernatural clarity. He was an incredibly attentive audience. He didn't interrupt. He simply absorbed every syllable, his facial expressions shifting subtly with the emotional tenor of her stories. When she spoke of the bullying she endured in high school, his jaw tightened, the muscles flexing with a sudden silent fury. When she described the perfect, quiet beauty of the sun rising over the Astoria Megla Bridge, his icy eyes softened with genuine wonder. "You see the world in a way I never have," Gabriel murmured, taking a sharp turn onto a secluded road that wound up towards the coastal cliffs. "My existence has been a series of tactical maneuvers of reading vibrations and anticipating violence. I have survived, Penelope, but I have never truly lived. Your words, they give color to a world I have only ever known in shades of gray." Penelope felt a strange fluttering in her chest, a warmth that had absolutely nothing to do with the heavy heating system of the luxury car. She looked at Gabriel's sharp profile, the aristocratic slope of his nose, the firm line of his lips. He was entirely lethal, a predator of the highest order, yet in this enclosed space he was treating her with a delicate reverence that left her utterly disarmed. "Where are we going?" Penelope asked, realizing they had passed the turnoff for her apartment above the laundromat 10 minutes ago. "I wanted to show you something," Gabriel said, steering the heavy car onto a gravel overlook. "A place where the vibrations of the ocean are the strongest. It is where I come when the silence becomes too heavy." He parked the Maybach near the edge of the cliff. Below them, the violent, churning waters of the Pacific Ocean crashed against the jagged rocks, sending massive plumes of white spray into the dark sky. The storm was ferocious here, howling against the reinforced glass of the car. Gabriel unbuckled his seatbelt and turned to face her. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the resonator resting on her plump thighs. Penelope hesitated, then nodded. She picked up the heavy metal object and held it out. Gabriel didn't take it from her. Instead, he reached out and placed his large, pale hands over hers, enveloping her thick, warm fingers in his freezing grip. The moment his skin touched hers over the metal, the hum of the resonator spiked dramatically. It wasn't just amplifying her voice anymore. It was creating a localized psychic field. Gabriel gasped, his eyes widening. Through the connection, he wasn't just hearing her words. He was feeling the echo of her emotions, her deep-seated insecurities, her profound exhaustion, her guarded but blossoming hope. And Penelope, to her absolute shock, felt him. She felt the cold, vast, echoing emptiness of his silent life, the suffocating pressure of his father's expectations, and the sudden blinding flare of devotion he felt toward her. It was an intimacy deeper than anything physical. Penelope let out a soft, trembling breath, tears suddenly pricking the corners of her eyes. "Gabriel," she whispered. Before Gabriel could respond, the atmosphere inside the car shifted violently. The faint, comforting hum of the resonator abruptly distorted, morphing into a harsh, high-pitched shriek that caused the metal to vibrate so violently it bruised Penelope's palms. Gabriel tore his hands away, his head snapping toward the darkness outside the window. The serene vulnerability in his eyes vanished instantly, replaced by the terrifying blank stare of an apex predator. His fangs, sharp and lethal, descended with a sickening click. "Get down!" Gabriel roared. He didn't have a voice to command her, but Penelope didn't need to hear him. She reacted to his sudden, violent movement, throwing her heavy upper body across the center console, just as the driver's side window exploded inward. A shower of tempered glass rained down on them. A massive, heavily tattooed arm reached through the shattered window, grabbing Gabriel by the throat. Penelope screamed, clutching the vibrating resonator to her chest. Gabriel didn't panic. He moved with a brutal, calculated efficiency. He seized the invading arm, dug his fingers into the pressure points, and twisted violently. A sickening snap echoed through the car, followed by a muffled roar of pain from outside. Gabriel kicked his door open with enough force to send his attacker flying backward into the muddy gravel. "Stay in the car," Gabriel commanded, communicating solely through the psychic link of the metal in Penelope's hands. His voice echoed in her mind, sharp and urgent. Gabriel lunged out into the driving rain. Penelope slowly raised her head, peering through the rain-lashed windshield. Her breath hitched in her throat. Surrounding the Maybach were 4 figures. They were dressed in dark tactical gear, their faces pale and twisted with malice. They weren't humans. They moved with the same terrifying fluid speed as Gabriel. The Harrison Syndicate, Gabriel's voice, echoed in Penelope's mind, a grim realization dawning upon him. Rivals from the Seattle territories. They must have tracked the energy signature of the resonator when it activated at the diner. Penelope watched in absolute horror as the 4 vampires descended upon Gabriel. It was a chaotic, brutal clash of immortal strength. Gabriel fought with terrifying prowess, a blur of lethal strikes, and bone-crushing grappling. He threw one attacker over the hood of the car, the impact denting the heavy metal. He dodged a sweeping kick from another, countering with a devastating punch to the creature's chest. But Gabriel was at a severe disadvantage. The Harrison vampires fought as a coordinated unit, communicating in hushed, lightning-fast whispers that Gabriel, entirely deaf, without direct physical contact with Penelope, and the relic could not hear. They were flanking him, using the noise of the storm and the darkness to coordinate blind spot attacks. A tall, wiry vampire slipped behind Gabriel, raising a heavy steel tire iron aimed directly at the base of Gabriel's skull. Gabriel focused on two attackers in front of him, had no idea the lethal blow was coming. Penelope's heart pounded against her ribs. She was terrified, paralyzed by the sheer violence unfolding before her. She was a waitress, a girl who spent her life trying to blend into the background. She had no place in a war of monsters. But as she watched the steel bar descending toward Gabriel's head, something feral and protective snapped inside her. He was the first person to truly hear her, to look at her without judgment. She couldn't let him die. She gripped the black metal resonator with both hands, squeezing it until her knuckles turned white. She focused every ounce of her will, every shred of her panic into the relic. "Gabriel, behind you, duck!" Penelope screamed at the top of her lungs inside the car. Her voice amplified by terror, and the ancient magic of the relic exploded like a sonic boom inside Gabriel's mind. Gabriel reacted instantaneously. He dropped into a deep crouch, the heavy steel tire iron swinging through the empty air where his head had been a fraction of a second before. Using his downward momentum, Gabriel swept his leg out, shattering the knees of the attacker behind him. The Harrison vampires froze, staring in shock at the Maybach. They hadn't anticipated the deaf prince having a spotter, let alone a human one wielding a legendary artifact. Gabriel rose to his feet, his chest heaving, his icy eyes burning with a furious, triumphant light. He looked through the shattered window at Penelope. Even through the driving rain and the darkness, Penelope saw the feral, bloody grin that spread across his face. "Keep watching, Penelope." Gabriel's voice echoed in her mind, dark and thrilling. "Be my ears, guide me." For the first time in her life, Penelope Higgins didn't shrink away from the spotlight. She sat up straight in the passenger seat, gripping the ancient metal, her eyes darting across the battlefield. She was no longer just a chubby waitress from the Rusty Anchor. She was the voice of the deaf king, the commander of an immortal predator. "Two on your left, Gabriel," Penelope commanded, her voice steady, ringing with newfound authority. "Show them what happens when you can hear." Penelope's voice became the sharpest weapon in Gabriel's immortal arsenal. "Two on your left, Gabriel," she yelled, her voice trembling but incredibly loud within the confines of the shattered vehicle. Gabriel pivoted gracefully. The driving rain was a thick curtain of grey, but he did not need his eyes. For over a century, Gabriel Lancaster had fought his battles within a stifling, oppressive void. He had survived by strictly anticipating the muscle twitches of his enemies and feeling the subtle displacement of the wind against his cold skin. But now he possessed a tactical radar that was absolute, guided by the sharp, panicked, yet incredibly precise voice of a woman who had spent her entire existence observing the world from the sidelines. Penelope Higgins was no longer invisible. She was the conductor of a lethal symphony, and Gabriel was her violent, beautiful instrument. "He is circling behind the trunk, the bold one," Penelope screamed, clutching the vibrating ancient resonator tightly against her heavy chest. Gabriel did not even turn his head. He executed a devastating back kick with perfect, terrifying accuracy. His heavy leather boot connected squarely with the jaw of the flanking vampire. The horrific sound of shattering bone was deafening in the storm, though Gabriel only experienced it as a deeply satisfying, resonant crack transmitted perfectly through Penelope's psychic link. The bald vampire crumpled lifelessly to the muddy, wet gravel, instantly incapacitated by the sheer, crushing force of the blow. "Good, now the tall one with the facial scar is drawing a blade. 3 o'clock. Gabriel dropped to one knee, flawlessly dodging a sweeping silver blade that would have easily decapitated him. In one fluid, brutal motion, he drove his pale fist upward, burying it deep into the attacker's abdomen with a sickening crunch. He hoisted the shrieking creature into the cold night air and hurled him violently over the steep edge of the rocky cliff. The vampire's panicked screams faded rapidly into the roaring black ocean churning far below. Only one attacker remained standing, a broad-shouldered, heavily scarred enforcer named Garrick, whose dark eyes burned with a chaotic mixture of terror and furious realization. Garrick abruptly stopped advancing on Gabriel. His predatory, bloodshot gaze shifted past the immortal prince, locking directly onto the shattered, ruined window of the black Maybach. He saw Penelope sitting there, her plump, terrified face illuminated by the faint, pulsing amber glow of the ancient relic tightly gripped in her chubby hands. Garrick realized instantly that the terrified human woman was the absolute source of Gabriel's sudden, impossible tactical awareness. The pig in the vehicle, Garrick roared furiously to his fallen, broken comrades, though they were entirely beyond hearing his desperate command. "Kill the human?" Penelope's heart violently seized in her chest. She saw Garrick deeply coil his muscular legs, his heavy boots digging fiercely into the wet, sliding gravel as he prepared to launch himself directly at the fragile windshield. She was completely trapped. Her thick, heavy body was wedged awkwardly across the car's center console, and the heavy, reinforced doors of the luxury Maybach were firmly locked from the outside. She squeezed her eyes tightly shut, raising the heavy, dark metal tuning fork in a pathetic, desperate attempt to shield herself against an immortal, bloodthirsty killing machine. "Gabriel, he is coming for me!" she cried out loudly. The response she felt in her mind was not a spoken voice, but a massive wave of pure, unadulterated fury, so intensely cold it made Penelope physically gasp for air. Garrick sprang forcefully off the muddy ground, becoming a terrifying blur of violent momentum aimed straight at the remaining glass. He never reached his target. Gabriel intercepted the enforcer in mid-air. The brutal collision sounded exactly like two massive freight trains smashing together at full speed. Gabriel violently tackled Garrick to the unforgiving ground landing mere inches from the Maybach's dented front bumper. The entire cliffside shook violently under the immense, crushing impact. Gabriel did not just defeat Garrick, he systematically dismantled him. Penelope watched wide-eyed through the rain-streaked, shattered windshield as Gabriel forcefully mounted the struggling, thrashing vampire, his pale fists coming down in a relentless, unbelievably brutal barrage of strikes. Gabriel's face was an emotionless, terrifying mask of pale marble, completely detached from the horrific, bloody violence his hands were currently inflicting. He did not stop his assault until Garrick finally lay completely motionless in the dark, freezing mud. A profound, heavy silence quickly descended upon the cliffside, save for the howling, bitter wind and the rhythmic, endless drumming of the coastal storm. Gabriel slowly, methodically rose to his feet. His expensive, dark cashmere sweater was completely torn and heavily soaked, his pale knuckles deeply stained with immortal, thick blood. He stood perfectly still for a long moment, his broad chest heaving, his beautiful face turned upward to the pouring, freezing rain. Then he looked at the ruined car. He walked slowly toward the shattered passenger window, his heavy boots crunching loudly on the loose gravel. Penelope sat up straight, her breath coming in shallow, ragged, panicking gasps. She was trembling uncontrollably, her heavy breasts rising and rapidly falling against the tight, stained fabric of her pink diner uniform. Gabriel leaned gently into the open window. He did not speak a single word aloud. He reached carefully through the broken, jagged glass, his bloody, freezing hands gently cupping Penelope's round, tear-stained, flushed face. He rested his cold forehead gently against hers. "You are completely unharmed," his deep voice echoed softly and beautifully in her mind, transmitted perfectly through the magical resonator she still clutched safely in her lap. It was not phrased as a question. It was a desperate emotional plea for absolute confirmation. "I am okay," Penelope whispered aloud, her raspy voice trembling badly. "I am okay. You got them all." Gabriel exhaled a long, incredibly shuddering breath, tightly closing his icy blue eyes. "I have spent over a century trapped in the suffocating dark, Penelope. But you are the brilliant lighthouse. You saved my life tonight. You did absolutely all the heavy lifting out there," she replied softly, a weak, very self-deprecating smile barely touching her trembling lips. "I just sat inside this fancy car and yelled loudly. Gabriel opened his eyes, staring incredibly deeply into hers. The absolute, undeniable adoration radiating from him was completely overwhelming, providing a stark, jarring contrast to the brutal massacre he had just ruthlessly committed. "Do not ever diminish what you truly are. You are utterly extraordinary." He pulled back slightly, his handsome expression quickly hardening as he strategically scanned the dark perimeter. "We cannot safely stay here. The Harrison Syndicate will absolutely send more soldiers. We must immediately go to the estate. My father needs to see this miracle. He needs to finally understand that the genetic curse is permanently broken." Penelope felt a terribly cold, sinking dread settle deeply in her stomach at the mere mention of Victor Lancaster. The ancient, terrifying king had looked at her earlier with the cold, calculating eyes of a cruel butcher assessing cheap livestock, but she nodded her head anyway. She was entirely irreversibly tethered to this terrifying bloody world, now completely bound by a humming piece of ancient black metal and the incredibly intoxicating realization that she was finally, desperately needed by someone. The sprawling Lancaster estate was significantly less a welcoming home and much more a terrifying Gothic fortress hidden perfectly deep within the damp forested hills of the Oregon Coast Range. Massive iron gates, towering and imposing 30 feet high, groaned loudly as they opened to carefully admit the battered, damaged Maybach. The long, winding driveway snaked slowly through ancient, heavily moss-draped pine trees before finally revealing a massive, sprawling mansion constructed entirely of dark, unforgiving stone, its narrow, arched windows glowing ominously with an eerie, distinctly unwelcoming golden light. Gabriel expertly parked the damaged vehicle near the massive, intricately carved oak front doors. He exited swiftly, walking quickly around the hood to properly open the passenger door for Penelope. She stepped out nervously, instantly feeling profoundly self-conscious once again. Her cheap uniform was horribly damp and terribly wrinkled, her sensible, non-slip shoes thickly caked in disgusting mud from the diner's alleyway. She felt ridiculously, painfully out of place amidst the overwhelming, suffocating grandeur of the immortal wealthy elite. Gabriel formally offered his strong arm. Penelope hesitated briefly, then nervously looped her thick, soft arm securely through his. The sudden physical contact instantly powerfully strengthened the magical psychic link of the resonator hidden securely in her uniform pocket. She clearly felt the tight, incredibly anxious coil of tension fiercely radiating from Gabriel's solid frame. He was mentally preparing for a very different, deeply personal kind of battle. They slowly entered the incredibly grand foyer. The expansive floor was perfectly polished, imported black marble, reflecting the brilliant light of a massive, dripping crystal chandelier. Standing imperiously at the base of a sweeping, dramatic dual staircase was Victor Lancaster. He had seamlessly changed from his tailored, expensive suit into a dark, luxurious velvet smoking jacket, looking every single inch the arrogant, aristocratic tyrant he truly was. Victor's dark, ancient eyes immediately sharply locked onto Gabriel's ruined, blood-stained clothes. I clearly felt the violent disturbance upon the territory lines. The Harrisons. Gabriel did not even attempt to sign his response. He simply looked deeply at Penelope and gave her a very slight, encouraging nod. Penelope reached slowly into her damp pocket, her thick fingers nervously wrapping tightly around the humming resonator. She cleared her dry throat, her raspy voice echoing quite loudly in the massive, cavernous hall. "Yes, 4 of them attacked. Gabriel brutally killed them all." Victor's piercing gaze snapped instantly to Penelope, his dark eyes narrowing in intense, cold calculation. He clearly heard her spoken words, but he also closely watched Gabriel's immediate, perfectly natural physical reaction to her voice. Gabriel had absolutely not read her lips. He had genuinely, miraculously heard her. "Utterly fascinating," Victor murmured quietly, slowly descending the marble stairs. His expensive leather shoes made absolutely no sound on the hard floor. "The relic truly perfectly functions. The old legends of the first covens were entirely accurate. It utilizes human bioelectricity to broadcast flawlessly on our psychic frequencies. A brilliant, albeit terribly crude workaround for my son's unfortunate deficiency." Victor stopped merely a few short feet away from them. He coldly looked at Penelope with a chilling, entirely clinical detachment. He rudely took in her messy, frizzy hair, her noticeably wide hips, her horribly stained pink uniform. "You have done my ancient family a truly great service tonight, Miss Higgins." Victor said smoothly, his voice dripping with condescension. "You have safely delivered a priceless, legendary artifact, one that finally restores the Lancaster heir to his full rightful predatory capacity. For this action, you will be handsomely compensated far beyond your wildest, pathetic human comprehension." Penelope frowned deeply, visibly tightening her nervous grip on Gabriel's strong arm. "Compensated? Indeed," Victor replied coldly, pulling a sleek, customized black checkbook from his jacket pocket. "I safely assume that $5 million will be completely sufficient to permanently secure your absolute unbroken silence. You will hand over the artifact, now leave this state tonight, and never attempt to contact my son again." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the insulting offer hung heavily in the freezing air. $5 million. It was a number so ridiculously large it felt entirely abstract, almost meaningless to Penelope. It meant absolutely no more exhausting double shifts at the greasy diner. It meant never having to endure the cruel, mocking laughs of awful men ever again. It meant total freedom. But as she furiously looked at Victor, she felt a profound, burning surge of deep anger. He was absolutely not offering her a generous gift. He was actively trying to completely erase her existence. He clearly saw her exactly as the rest of the cruel world always did, a disposable, entirely unimportant woman, whose only actual value was the shiny object she happened to be holding. Before Penelope could angrily speak, Gabriel stepped swiftly forward, placing his massive body firmly between Penelope and his terrible father. The psychic link violently flared with his uncontrollable, boiling rage. "Tell him no," Gabriel fiercely commanded inside Penelope's racing mind. Penelope firmly squared her soft shoulders, her double chin lifting highly and defiantly. "No!" Victor paused abruptly, his expensive pen hovering frozen over the black checkbook. A highly dangerous, incredibly lethal stillness rapidly settled over his sharp, aristocratic features. "Excuse me, I firmly said no," Penelope bravely repeated, her voice remaining remarkably, surprisingly steady. "I am absolutely not taking your money, and I am certainly not leaving. Miss Higgins," Victor softly said, his cold tone instantly dropping to a highly threatening, dangerous purr. "You are merely a fat, fragile human carelessly holding a sacred Lancaster heirloom. You are painfully, hopelessly out of your depth here. Hand me the resonator right now, or I will gladly take it straight from your bleeding corpse. The choice is entirely yours." Gabriel let out an incredibly low, deeply feral snarl. He absolutely did not need the magical relic to clearly hear the violent threat. He could easily read his father's highly aggressive, tense posture perfectly. Gabriel raised his bloody hands, signing very sharply and intensely aggressively at his father. Penelope nervously watched the entirely silent, furious exchange, clearly feeling the intense emotional translation pouring through the relic. Gabriel was incredibly furious. He was fiercely telling his father that the relic was completely useless without her presence. Victor scoffed loudly, signing quickly back with incredibly sharp, highly dismissive, angry motions. "Do not be totally absurd, Gabriel. Any human battery will easily do. We will simply compel a much more suitable, attractive vessel. We absolutely do not need this grotesque, disgusting peasant stinking up our pristine halls." The horrific insult hit Penelope exactly like a brutal physical blow to the stomach. The word grotesque loudly echoed inside her ears, violently reopening decades of deep, incredibly painful psychological wounds. She looked sadly down at her dirty shoes, hot tears violently burning her eyes, her previous brave resolve suddenly crumbling into dust. She slowly let go of Gabriel's arm, taking a very shaky, defeated step backward toward the heavy front door. "Penelope, stop!" Gabriel loudly commanded aloud. His rough voice was terribly ragged, the unused vocal cords straining painfully, but he bravely spoke the actual words himself, completely refusing to use the psychic link. He turned quickly to her, entirely purposefully ignoring his furious father. He took her plump, terribly trembling hands gently into his own. "He is lying!" Gabriel's beautiful voice flooded her mind, incredibly rich with deep, desperate sincerity. "The relic explicitly requires a highly specific, rare bioelectric resonance. It absolutely requires a beautiful soul that perfectly matches the frequency of the wielder. I tried desperately to hold it alone. It was completely silent. I tried to use it with Garrick's blood. It was totally dead. It only ever sings beautifully for you, Penelope. Only you." Gabriel turned very slowly, intensely back to his father. His icy blue eyes were totally devoid of any remaining filial respect. They were the terrifying, absolute eyes of a reigning king finally claiming his true throne. "Tell him," Gabriel powerfully echoed inside Penelope's mind, his psychic voice loudly ringing with absolute, utterly unbreakable authority. "Tell him that she firmly stays. Tell him she is absolutely not a disposable vessel. She is entirely mine." Penelope quickly swallowed the painful lump in her dry throat. The terrible fear was still present, but it was completely undeniably eclipsed by the sheer, highly overwhelming power of Gabriel's absolute devotion. She tightly gripped the black metal, feeling it pulse rapidly, with a brilliant, totally defiant heat. She looked Victor Lancaster dead deeply in his ancient eye, her soft, round, flushed face setting permanently into a fierce mask of pure, unbreakable steel. "Gabriel firmly says I stay," Penelope stated incredibly clearly, her strong voice beautifully echoing off the cold marble walls, permanently shattering the dark silence of the Lancaster estate forever. "He powerfully says I am not a vessel, I am his. And if you desperately want this artifact, Victor, you are going to have to forcefully go through both of us to get it." Victor Lancaster merely stared blankly at the heavy-set, exhausted waitress standing bravely in the ruined pink uniform. For the absolute first time in over 300 bloody years, the terrifying vampire king of the Pacific Northwest was entirely, utterly speechless. He fully realized with a deeply cold, truly terrifying certainty that his deaf son had absolutely not just found a magical tool to finally hear the noisy world. He had actually found a fierce, incredibly powerful queen who would undoubtedly teach him exactly how to ruthlessly rule it. The heavy, suffocating silence inside the grand foyer was broken only by the steady, rhythmic dripping of Gabriel's immortal blood onto the immaculate black marble. Victor Lancaster stared deeply at Penelope, his ancient aristocratic features tightening into a highly terrifying mask of pure, calculated malice. He absolutely did not yell. He did not immediately attack. Instead, Victor simply laughed, a dry, echoing, cruel sound that sent a horrific, paralyzing chill straight down Penelope's spine. "You foolish, entirely ignorant human creature," Victor sneered softly, stepping slowly closer to where she stood. "Do you truly, honestly believe the first covens built such a legendary, powerful relic without a terrible cost? You actually think your pathetic bioelectric field is an infinite magical well of energy?" Gabriel immediately stiffened, his extremely broad shoulders tensing defensively. "What is he talking about?" Gabriel demanded through the intimate psychic link, his internal mind voice heavily tinged with sudden sharp anxiety. Victor looked directly at his son, deliberately signing with cruel, agonizing slowness, so Penelope could understand the terrifying context. "The resonator absolutely does not merely borrow human energy, Gabriel. It actively, aggressively consumes it. It feeds hungrily upon the human soul's delicate resonance. Every single time she bravely speaks through it, every single time it powerfully amplifies your dead senses, it violently drains her vital life force. In precisely 6 months, her weak human heart will simply stop beating. She is merely a disposable battery, and she is rapidly, inevitably depleting as we speak." Penelope loudly gasped, looking fearfully down at the heavy, jagged black metal clutched tightly in her trembling, plump hands. The previously warm, comforting hum suddenly felt exactly like a vicious parasite burrowing deeply into her fragile veins. She suddenly recognized the heavy, unnatural ache deep in her joints, the profound, overwhelming exhaustion dragging heavily at her tired bones. She had foolishly blamed it on her terrible double shift at the rusty Anchor Diner, but now she finally realized the incredibly terrifying truth. The ancient relic was literally slowly killing her. No, Gabriel's powerful voice violently shattered the rising panic in her racing mind, ringing beautifully with absolute heartbreaking desperation. He reached out quickly, desperately, trying to physically pry the dark artifact from her chubby fingers. "Let it go, Penelope. Drop it right now. I absolutely will not ever allow you to die for my selfish convenience. I would gladly return to the absolute suffocating dark forever than steal your beautiful life." but Penelope held on fiercely, stepping quickly away from him. Her noticeably wide hips bumped hard into a heavy antique oak side table. "Gabriel, please stop. If I drop it now, you go completely deaf again. You will not be able to defend yourself against the Harrison Syndicate." "He absolutely won't have to," Victor interrupted coldly, his dark eyes narrowing. "I will simply lock him safely away in the subterranean vaults until we eventually find a more suitable, attractive replacement. One we absolutely do not mind ruthlessly discarding when they inevitably expire." Suddenly, the massive, intricate stained glass window situated high above the sweeping grand staircase violently shattered inward. The freezing storm from the treacherous Oregon coast raged furiously into the pristine, luxurious mansion, bringing with it a highly terrifying, coordinated swarm of heavily armed dark figures. The Harrison Syndicate had absolutely not just sent a minor ambush to the coastal cliffs, they had purposefully launched a massive, full-scale invasion directly upon the Lancaster estate. 10 heavily armed, incredibly lethal rival vampires dropped simultaneously onto the polished marble floor. Their sharp fangs completely bared their eyes, glowing brightly with intense, supernatural bloodlust. They had perfectly followed the massive psychic signature of the activated resonator, directly to the absolute vulnerable heart of their wealthy enemy's heavily guarded stronghold. Gabriel absolutely did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He threw his massive, muscular body violently forward, forcefully intercepting 3 heavily armed attackers before their heavy tactical boots even touched the marble floor. But he was unfortunately fighting in a massive, highly echoing chamber, and Victor was suddenly violently thrown backward by a brutally powerful strike from the Syndicate's massive, imposing leader, a terrifyingly scarred ancient immortal named Kalen. Penelope watched the chaotic, bloody violence unfold, her human heart hammering violently against her ribs. She looked down at the humming resonator. She clearly felt the terrifying drain on her soul, the deeply parasitic pull of the ancient, unforgiving magic. But she also strongly, undeniably felt Gabriel's desperate, overwhelming need for her guidance. He was fighting blindly in the dangerous periphery, completely overwhelmed by the sheer, staggering numbers of the rival clan. "To your immediate right, Gabriel," she screamed loudly, purposefully pouring her vital life force intentionally into the dark metal. The psychic connection violently flared with a blinding, intensely agonizing heat that burned her skin. Duck completely under the silver blade, Gabriel moved absolutely flawlessly, guided perfectly by her desperate voice, his pale fist brutally crushing the fragile ribcage of an attacking rival vampire. Victor painfully struggled to his feet, angrily wiping thick, dark, immortal blood from his sharp, aristocratic chin. He looked closely at Penelope with genuine, entirely unprecedented shock. The fat, ordinary waitress was completely willingly sacrificing her own precious life force simply to keep his deaf son alive. She was undeniably overweight, entirely unremarkable by the superficial, highly demanding standards of their immortal, perfect world, yet she undeniably possessed a fiery, truly unbreakable spirit that easily rivaled the oldest, most legendary warrior queens of Europe. Behind the marble pillar, Penelope coughed violently, heavily, stumbling as a massive wave of intense, sickening dizziness violently washed over her exhausted, heavy body. "Gabriel, they are actively trying to flank you from behind." Her vision suddenly blurred dangerously. The ornate edges of the massive grand foyer began to darken rapidly. The physical cost was incredibly steep, completely agonizing, but Penelope absolutely refused to stop helping him. For the absolute first time in her 26 years of sad existence, she truly undeniably mattered. The incredibly bloody, brutal battle, fiercely raging inside the opulent Lancaster estate, continued with terrifying, entirely unyielding ferocity. The expensive, imported black marble floor was quickly violently reduced to a highly chaotic, incredibly slippery battlefield consisting of completely shattered, crystal-broken antique furniture and thick pools of dark, immortal blood. Gabriel fought relentlessly with the raw, deeply brutal desperation of a terrified man desperately protecting his absolutely only lifeline to incredibly beautiful auditory world he had truly just discovered. But Kalen, the massive, highly ruthless, intelligent leader of the rival Harrison syndicate, quickly recognized the true hidden source of Gabriel's sudden, highly impossible tactical dominance. Kalen brutally shoved the injured Victor violently aside, aggressively throwing the ancient proud king violently against a heavily carved marble pillar. Kalen's deeply bloodshot, hateful eyes locked instantly directly onto Penelope, who was currently slumped incredibly heavily against the antique oakside table, desperately clutching the violently vibrating black resonator in her sweaty hands. "Kill the fat human immediately!" Kalen roared incredibly loudly, lunging directly and violently across the blood-slicked marble floor toward her. Gabriel was unfortunately completely pinned down heavily by two other massive syndicate soldiers. He absolutely could not physically reach her in time to save her. "Penelope, you must run!" Gabriel's completely terrified, totally heartbroken voice screamed loudly and desperately inside her mind. "Drop the cursed relic immediately and run away." Penelope Higgins absolutely did not run. She firmly planted her sturdy, non-slip diner shoes incredibly firmly on the ruined marble floor. Her incredibly thick, heavy legs, extremely tired from many long years of constantly carrying her heavy burden frame, locked instantly into a completely immovable, totally defiant stance. She watched Kalen rushing furiously toward her, his highly lethal, incredibly sharp fangs totally bared, clearly expecting her to pathetically cower, cry, or foolishly flee. She looked deeply down at the loudly humming, highly parasitic black metal clutched tightly in her hand. If it greedily fed completely on her specific bioelectric energy, perhaps she could actively, forcefully overload the ancient device. She absolutely didn't try to pull away or hide. Instead, she forcefully, aggressively shoved every single ounce of her deep-seated, lifelong anger, her countless years of painful humiliation, and her incredibly powerful, newly blossoming love for Gabriel directly into the ancient magical device. "I am absolutely not running away ever again," Penelope screamed forcefully at the absolute top of her exhausted lungs. The ancient resonator absolutely did not just hum quietly. It violently, terrifyingly shrieked. The dark, jagged metal suddenly glowed brightly with a blinding, intensely terrifying white light that completely illuminated the massive room. The ancient, highly specific psychic frequency instantly, violently inverted. Instead of quietly draining her fragile life force, the relic actively functioned as a massive, entirely unprecedented amplifier, instantly unleashing a truly devastating, highly localized shockwave of pure destructive sonic bioenergy. Kalen brutally hit the massive, invisible, violently vibrating wall of pure sound and was instantly, incredibly violently thrown forcefully backward through the freezing air, crashing incredibly brutally straight through the massive heavy oak front doors and flying completely out into the torrential, freezing coastal rain. The remaining highly terrified syndicate attackers immediately dropped heavily to the ruined floor, desperately clutching their incredibly sensitive, bleeding ears as the highly overwhelming, incredibly high-pitched frequency completely painfully ruptured their heightened supernatural senses. The incredibly sudden, entirely paralyzing distraction was absolutely all Gabriel realistically needed. He immediately moved forward with highly lethal, completely blurring speed, systematically efficiently dispatching the entirely disoriented, completely deafened attackers with highly brutal, incredibly bone-crushing efficiency. Within exactly 60 short seconds, the highly massive grand foyer was completely, entirely, terrifyingly silent once again, save for the freezing, howling coastal wind aggressively pouring directly through the entirely shattered front doorway. Penelope fell incredibly heavily directly to her bruised knees, completely, entirely drained of all her energy. The dark resonator finally slowly slipped from her sweaty, incredibly trembling thick fingers, clattering extremely loudly against the cold stone floor. Gabriel was instantly, desperately at her side. He dropped forcefully to his knees, completely ignoring the intense pain radiating throughout his heavily battered, bleeding body, and carefully, incredibly gently pulled her heavy, totally exhausted frame incredibly tightly into his massive, strong arms. "Penelope," he pleaded incredibly softly and desperately, in her fading mind, pressing his incredibly cold, marble-like forehead incredibly gently against her warm skin. "Please, you must breathe. Do not ever leave me alone in the absolute dark again. Penelope slowly opened her extremely weary, heavy eyes, weakly offering a highly exhausted, incredibly beautiful, genuine smile. "I'm still right here," she whispered incredibly softly. Victor Lancaster slowly, painfully walked over to them, tightly clutching his severely, brutally injured ribs. He looked closely at the completely broken syndicate soldiers, and then deeply down at the heavily overweight, incredibly ordinary diner waitress, who had literally just fully unleashed a terrifying power entirely unseen in many centuries. He finally completely bowed his proud aristocratic head, highly respectfully. "The absolute throne is officially yours, my powerful son," Victor conceded incredibly quietly. "And you have truly chosen a highly formidable, entirely magnificent queen." Gabriel gently, incredibly lovingly lifted Penelope securely into his massive arms, easily carrying her heavy, beautiful weight. He absolutely didn't care about royal titles, ancient curses, or superficial beauty. He truly deeply loved the amazing woman who finally gave him sound. If you enjoyed this thrilling vampire romance full of unexpected twists and dramatic turns, don't forget to hit that like button and share this incredible story with your friends. Did Penelope's bravery shock you? Let us know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you want to hear more amazing, heart-pounding stories where the underdog finally gets the ultimate revenge and true love conquers all the darkest curses, make sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell. We upload new intense romance dramas every week. Thanks for watching and stay tuned.